It is an historic day. The president outlining the new compromise between the House and the Senate on the new tax cut plan. Biggest tax cut since the 80s and Ronald Reagan, 37 years. Bigger than Jack Kennedy's. In 1961, there's going to be a vote. We think Monday, could be Tuesday. This very likely to pass. The Democrats going bananas over it. They're going to throw the kitchen sink at it because, well, if it passes and the economy grows to 3.8, 3.9, 4, 4.1%, well, then their dreams of getting their big corner offices, the big staffs back, and being in the majority, well, they get dashed because well, the economy is going to grow. People get more money. They get more money in their pocket. They pay lower taxes. The economy keeps growing. Their kids move out of the basement. Their basement becomes great again, and the economy continues to go up, and they get higher wages. And then what are the Democrats going to do? But the Democrats, all of them opposed to this bill. They're saying it's tax cuts for the rich and things of that nature. Now, joining us now to blast, we think, the Trump tax cut plan and get his perspective on it, our good friend, Congressman from the 3rd District of Virginia, our good friend, Democrat, Bobby Scott. One thing you can always get from Bobby Scott is you're going to tell you exactly what's on his mind. That's why we're big fans of his. And honesty is the best policy. He's the king of candor, and he's with us now. And we are coming to you live today from your nation's capital, right by the Congress on our new studio in 9th Street. So it's good to be here. Congressman Bobby Scott, great to have you with us, sir.
John, good to be back. How you doing?
I know. I told your staff we got to get you on a regular basis, so I'm going to get that worked out today now that I'm up in D.C. all the time. I'm doing fine, and I want to get your take on this Trump tax cut plan that's been negotiated. By the way, you guys don't even have a seat at the table. Tell us your opinion of it.
Well, I think it's just as instructive to get the take on what Republicans are saying about it. One said that from South Carolina said that we ought to stop calling it a middle-class tax cut and call it the corporate tax cut that it is, because that's where most of the money goes, and it would be easier to explain because that's actually what it is. You had others say that we have to pass this tax cut because our contributions would dry up if we don't pass it. One said he's talking to a contributor. He said he wasn't going to give a dime until after the tax cut bill was finished, and if he voted against it, don't bother to call back. I mean, that's what Republicans are saying about the bill. The fact is, you might as well say it can cure cancer. I mean, there's no evidence from this that there's going to be any significant growth. In fact, for $1.5 trillion, there's virtually nothing you can do with $1.5 trillion that would not produce more growth than tax cuts for the wealthy. If you had tax cuts for the middle class and working class, people would actually spend the money, you'd have more growth. If you create jobs through infrastructure, roads, bridges, and other things, you'd have more growth. If you targeted expenditures to summer jobs for low-income teenagers, you know they're going to spend the money. AmeriCorps, you know those are going to be people who are going to spend the money. Increases in education, the arts, research grants. In fact, they've estimated with this thing this thing might create a couple of 100,000 jobs. If you just directly hired people with $500 billion, you'd run out of money before you'd run out of unemployed people trying to get jobs. Everybody drawing unemployment, that's less than 10 million people. You could hire with a $50,000 job overnight with less than $500 billion. 10 million people, $50,000 each, less than 10 million. There are less than 10 million people drawing unemployment today. So you could do 10, 20, 30 times more growth with other things that you could do with $1.5 trillion. Now, you talk about a middle-class tax cut. Let's just do a little arithmetic.
Sure.
It's a net $1.5 trillion tax cut. Net 1.5. If you do the corporate tax and the estate tax, that's couples with an estate over $11 million. If you just take those two, that's $1.5 trillion. Everybody else net, it's about a tax increase. So if you're not a corporation and don't have $11 million a couple, then your taxes on average are going up. Some are going up, some are going down, but net it's a tax increase. And so when people are talking about what the middle class is going to get, net it's a tax increase. And let me tell you, they're going to be first in line to pay for this $1.5 trillion because they're going to be cutting Medicare and Social Security.
I tell you what,
Medicaid,
Congressman,
education, and everything
you got
else.
the Democrat talking points on this down pat. I have to hand it to you.
That's not Democratic talking points. I haven't heard anybody else say that it's a net tax increase if you're not a corporation.
It's not a net tax increase.
That's something I figured out.
An average family making $75,000, which is the majority of my listeners and many of your constituents, are going to save with two kids an average of $2,000. If they're making $90,000, they're going to save $3,000. I mean, you just do the math. When you double the deduction to a married couple to $24,000, the first $24,000 you make is not taxed at a dime. Then you get $100,000 taxed at 12%. If you got two children under 17, you're going to take $4,000 right off your tax bill. So every number that we have run, everybody that has called up my wife and who you know on the Senate bill, which is basically what they've negotiated, she did a computer program on it. And almost every caller that we had that called in was going to save money. So to say that's an increase for the middle class, how is it an increase when the deductions go up and your tax rate goes down? How is that an increase?
But because you lose a lot of deductions if you pay.
That's only if you itemize.
You lose deductions for state and local taxes.
If you itemize. And if you're itemizing and you don't take the $24,000 standard deduction, I mean, this is why the Democrats are not being honest.
On average, you're right. People are going to save
only 30% of the people.
A lot of people are going to pay more. A lot of people are going to pay less.
There's nobody going to pay more.
If you're not a corporation, John, this is arithmetic. It's a 1.5 net. Everybody else is a net. It's over 1.5 trillion corporations and a state tax. Everybody else, on average, will pay. It's a net tax increase. Now, some will go up, some will go down. But if you're not saving any money, if you're not spending any money, you can't be getting a tax cut.
I just had a caller in your district an hour ago, right? Makes $50,000, has a family of 6, 4 children. You know what his income tax will be? His federal income tax? 0, right? 0, because he's got 4 children. He's got an $8,000 deduction. He's paying 12% income on $26,000. So under the existing plan,
because you lose your the standard deduction is increased, but your dependent deductions are eliminated.
You don't need the dependent deductions because you're able to take $2,000 in a tax credit right off the bottom. So last year he paid $2,000.
5 years from now?
Well, then you're not going to have children. So then,
when 5 years from now, a lot of these benefits for the middle class evaporate.
How do they evaporate?
They're sunset.
Oh, that means that if you're still in Congress, Congressman Scott, that means that a majority of people in Congress would have to then let this tax cut sunset, which would be voting for the biggest tax increase in the history of the Republic. Nobody's going to do that. These are not going to sunset.
Wait a minute, John.
Because you're going to get the growth.
If you're going to continue it, then let's score it. Because then instead of a $1.5 trillion tax cut, it's about a $2 trillion tax cut. Who's going to pay for it?
You're going to pay for it by growing the economy.
No. There is no credible economist, not on the payroll of the Republican Party, who will suggest you come anywhere close to paying for this with these tax cuts. Now, if you had aimed the tax cuts lower to people that actually spend the money, you'd get more growth. If you'd spend it on job creation, you'd get more growth. This is the number one worst place you can put your money, upper end tax cuts, for growth. And that's because if you give somebody who made $1 million $50,000, they're not. If they wanted a car, they'd have bought the car. If they needed a refrigerator, they'd have already bought the refrigerator. You give somebody $50,000, already made $1 million, they're going to pay off their credit cards, they're going to max out their 401k, and they're going to buy some mutual funds. They're not going to spend it. But you give 100 people $500, low to moderate income people $500, they'll spend it before the check gets back to Washington. And that's how you do growth. You do not do growth with upper end tax cuts.
That's what they're doing. Everybody
making worst thing that you can do for growth. And if you look at some of the ways they're paying for it, they're reducing. If you've got a lot of medical expenses, if you've got a child with a serious illness, you lose your medical deductions. They tax people in graduate school. No deduction for student loans, all the massive debt. One thing I hear everywhere I go is all the money students have to borrow to go to school. They're going to lose their deduction on interest.
Yes,
those
they are
the kind of things that they chip away. Now, you may find people that aren't losing losing that deduction because they don't have student loans or they don't have high local taxes. You can find a lot of people that'll benefit, and you'll find a lot of people that'll be a lot worse off. On average, it's a zero because the corporate tax and the estate tax eat up the $1.5 trillion.
Okay, so let me just say two things. Number one, as far as students being able to deduct interest, the object of growing the economy is that so the students who came out of school can get a higher paying job, get a raise, get a better job, and then pay it back. I mean, deducting the interest doesn't matter if you get a better job and you go from $38,000 to $53,000. What the hell's the difference if you pay the interest back? But the other thing is, what you're talking about.
You try to explain that to a student who's deducting his interest now.
We want the student to make more money, Bobby. We want him to. We don't want to give him a government handout. We want that student to come out with that bachelor's or that master's degree and get a better job and get a raise and get on a future path to make more money.
Yeah,
That's what this is
you're
about.
Right. The student shouldn't get a handout, but the state is not spending what it is traditionally spent on education. When you and I were in college, the state was spending about 2/3 of the cost to go to a public college. Now it's less than 1/3. And who's paying the difference? The student has to borrow the money, and so that's a transfer of resources from what used to be the state. Now the student has to pay for it mostly with loans.
Look, college
when you and I were in college, people didn't come out with these kind of loans, maybe a little bit of loans.
University fees doesn't have anything to do with this conversation.
Most of the people are coming out debt-free.
Okay, look, university fees and paying for, big football programs don't have anything to do with our conversation. Let me just ask you this. Do you think that the United States corporate tax rate at 35%, which is the highest in the free world, where Ireland is 8%, Canada is 9%, Japan is 7.5%. Do you think that a 35% corporate rate, do you think that is competitive in a global market?
Well, if you reduce the corporate rate, you ought to increase the individual rate. That would be tax reform. This is just a tax cut. First of all, people don't pay the 35%. A lot of them don't pay anything. General Electric hadn't paid taxes in decades.
Why?
One of the most profitable corporations in America. But and so people ought to talk about what they actually pay, not what the sticker price is on the rates. But here we are up here talking about a $1.5 trillion tax cut at a time when the governor had to send out notices to families on the children's health insurance program, CHIP, that we can't afford $14 billion. $1.5 trillion. We can't afford $14 billion. Last year, Bernie Sanders had a plan for free college. Everybody can go to college for free. $900 billion. $900 billion. Everybody said that's so extravagant. Well, how can we possibly afford that? That's $0.9 trillion. $0.9 trillion. We're talking about a $1.5 trillion tax cut. I think most people would rather have free college and maybe a $600 billion tax cut. But no, we would give $1.5 trillion. Some people's taxes are actually going up. And as you're suggesting, after they expire, it's not even a $1.5 trillion because, as you suggested, in 5 years they can extend some tax cuts. So it's probably a $2 or $3 trillion tax cut by the time you finish with it. Who's going to pay for it?
Well, you got to pay for it by growing the economy.
Economists have said this thing is going to pay for itself.
When the Reagan tax cuts finally took hold in the 80s, revenue going into the Treasury doubled in that 10-year period from when the
it doubled because he raised taxes. The biggest we were so far in the ditch that he had the biggest tax increase. People forget that part of it. He cut taxes, biggest tax increase to get the economy back, and we were fixing it up. President George H.W. Bush had to raise taxes to make up for it. President Clinton finally had to raise taxes to make up for it, and we're finally back on track to paying off the national debt. before the Republicans came back in and wrecked the economy again with a bunch of tax cuts. We were on track in 2001 to paying off the entire national debt. No government bonds after 2008 at the rate we were going. We had such surpluses. 20 million jobs during the Clinton administration.
You started the conversation, Congressman Scott, by saying we should take this money and create government jobs. Didn't Obama do that with the shovel ready? How many jobs did he create with that? Remember, right? We were going to have Amtrak expanded and shovel ready jobs, and we had Solyndra. We spent all those trillions of dollars, and we got nothing.
Depression in recent history.
I mean, under Obama, you had under 1% growth. That was supposed to be the new normal. Now,
let me remember where he started. That was the worst collapse of the economy. I mean, you got to go back to the Great Depression to find us further in the ditch than we were when he was sworn in. The stock market was going down 500 to 1,000 points a day.
All right, I'm going to give you something that we can agree on, and I want my audience to know this. A lot of the Democrats that come on my show are not credible when they're talking about the debt because it doubled under Obama and they didn't say a word, including Tim Kaine, et cetera. But from the first day I walked into your office, you said to me the debt is a real issue. You had a bunch of charts you showed me. You had graphs. You had them hanging up all over your office. You were saying it was going to destroy the country long term. So you're credible on the debt. There's no question.
Don't blame me for all of the Obama debt, because when they had that cliff deal, I was one of the few Democrats to oppose it. I thought we should have.
That's right.
We should not have extended $3.9 trillion in tax cuts. I thought that was the most regrettable thing that's happened since the Bush tax cuts that turned the surpluses into debt. Had we not done that, had we not agreed to the cliff deal, and that was bipartisan. Everybody wanted $3.9 trillion in tax cuts. Most of the people that voted against it said the tax cuts weren't big enough. A handful of us voted that we shouldn't do anything on tax cuts until we got the budget straight. And so you're right. As a percentage of GDP, the debt went down significantly under Obama, but it should have gone down a lot more had they not agreed to that cliff deal. Jim Moran from Northern Virginia and I were some of the few that voted against it because we believed it was fiscally irresponsible.
And you got to go back to the genesis of where the national debt started was when George Bush II launched two wars and then did a tax cut on top of it. You don't go to war and then cut taxes.
Two tax cuts.
Two tax cuts and two wars. You want to go to war.
2003, two wars that weren't paid for, and then to add insult to injury, a prescriptive drug benefit that wasn't paid for. When we passed Obamacare, we raised taxes to pay for it. It was paid for. Now he had a prescriptive drug benefit, half $1 trillion.
He did the prescription. He did the prescription drug benefit to win Florida in his re-election campaign. So,
not paid for.
Look, I happen to believe that George Bush II is, if not the worst, one of the worst presidents in history. So on that we can agree. Congressman, we're out of time. This tax cut is going to pass. The economy is going to explode. And
so what do you mean by explode? That'd be one.
It's going to just take off like a bat out of Hades. You're going to get jobs. You're going to get wages. People are going to get more money. And it's all good. It's all good. At the end of the day, you're going to get reelected because people are going to have more money in their pocket, and they're going to say, boy, that Bobby Scott, man, maybe he didn't vote for this tax cut, but, he's part of the government that has helped this economy grow like crazy. So it's all going to be good, Congressman. I got your back.
All right, sounds good to me.
I got your back. Okay. John Fredericks Radio
Thank
Network.
You, John.